and yes, there are probably many little Bibles in there for many of us in our work. And I've also had the great privilege and pleasure of working alongside Lesley when she held the Newton Academy Fellowship funded by the British Academy, and was based with us in Edge Hill while I worked there, where Lesley is currently visiting professor still. I have learned a lot from working with Lesley. I have learned a lot professionally about action research. I have learned a lot personally about sharing, about being a good action researcher. It's just been a lovely journey to work with Lesley. And I'm wearing my South African beadwork today in honor of Lesley being here. Earrings and my necklace. And I'm just beyond thrilled to see you again, Lesley. And you're very, very welcome.
Wow, thank you so much. And I'm really touched. I feel like crying now. The electricity's just come back on, so that's something to be happy about. I also, yeah, sounds very much like a eulogy. Thank you. You are so kind to me. But you know, I have worked with Mary for quite a few years, and we've done wonderful things together. Publications. I've also worked with Jack too, and Mary, and so there's, you know, and I know Jackie well too. So I feel as though I know a lot of people who are here at the moment. So I feel quite at home today. So let's move on, because I don't want to go over my time, because we have a lot of speakers today. So what I would like to learn today is, and I think that is why I asked you this, because I want you to know which audience I was here, and what really impresses me is the amount of practitioners that are working in NEARI, and people who are not primarily full-time academics, but like Marion and her co-editors that are just producing book after book. And I just think that's absolutely wonderful. So my story about action research. There you go, Jack.
Okay.
Like most of you, I started off my research journey in qualitative research. Okay, I did my PhD, and I only did that in 2004. So I'm relatively, for my age, new to academia and research. And I was trying to understand problems that other people had, to make recommendations to them of what they should do to solve them. And of course, that was what you did in research, and it all seemed perfectly normal to me. Then Jean McNiff turned up in South Africa. Not just turned up, she was invited, of course, by my then Dean, Anna Naidu, at Nelson Mandela, which is now Nelson Mandela University, was University of Port Elizabeth at that time. And we invited to a workshop. And that actually changed my whole trajectory of research when I came to understand what action research is. And she told us, most of you know, Jean, about action research, the swampy lowlands and the high plains, values-based and values-driven research. And I started to see that this was research that could actually make a difference and bring about personal, group, and institutional change. But that it had to start with me and my practice and the influence I could have within my social ecologies. And so Jean and Jack worked closely together at that time, and their co-authored books became my Bible. Just as Marinda said, my book is her Bible. Very kind of you, Marinda. Their books were my Bible, and it guided myself and others in action research. And we started an action research unit at the then UPE. But at that time, my focus was on HIV and AIDS in education. That's how I'd been brought into education and been invited to join the faculty of education, because nobody else wanted to touch HIV and AIDS. They thought it was a health issue and not, of course, what it is really a social and educational issue as well. And so my focus was more on how can we prepare teachers to cope with the trauma and the social consequences that are coming into the classroom with learners. And so many publications came out of this. There was a whole team of us in South Africa that were working and working with the Higher Education AIDS Institution and EU-funded projects on helping teachers and the education system to cope with HIV and AIDS consequences. And what I learned from this period was that people are resilient. And the more risk factors they face, the more resilient they become. These teachers could solve their own problems. They had the capacity. They were driven by values of compassion, care, Ubuntu, which is not the individual, but a collective philosophy, to make the difference in the lives of the children that they were teaching. But it also became apparent to me that slowly that the drivers of HIV, the things that were fueling the pandemic, such as poverty, gender inequalities, specific cultural beliefs, had to be tackled on a wider basis. Prevention education was HIV education was in the school curriculum, for instance, but it was more prevention education, or don't stigmatize people with HIV. It wasn't about how do we actually change our life, change our behavior, change our lives to stop the spreading. So we had to change. To me, to stop HIV spreading, we had to start working more with the social and economic circumstances that create this fertile terrain for HIV to spread. For example, in Europe, you can say it was contained in Europe, wear a condom, and then you won't, spread the virus. But in South Africa, males will not easily wear a condom because of cultural beliefs, and especially with their wives. And then another sort of cultural belief is that, it's fine to have a wife, but you also have quite a few girlfriends. So therefore, the most vulnerable population in South Africa, the people who were made vulnerable by the system, were married women. So it was nothing to do with morals and so on. And young girls who were poverty-stricken saw having older boyfriends whom they didn't wear a condom, they couldn't ask them to wear a condom, but it was a way to get material gain that they would never have got, to feel like a normal teenager and so on. So it's a very complex situation. And this abject poverty they would go through leads to a loss of hope for a better future, and so on. But as HIV was changing, and we'd done a lot of work, we started to work more with community-based research and trying to bring about change at that level, help people to realize this for themselves and bring about change in their own. And we had to encourage deep critical reflection, identification of values, helping people imagine a better future in a hopeless situation, and more involve people in their own change. So then it was a serendipitous encounter, but there, Jack, I have to thank you again, because the next big influence in my journey was the great Orton Zuberskeret, who's my mentor, one of my few mentors. In fact, it was Jack who introduced me to her. Thank you, Jack. Jack sent an email one day and said, Orton, I think I want to introduce you to Lesley and somebody else at DUT, because I think they're doing work that you would be interested in. So, of course, me being me, I immediately wrote her and said, oh, yes, I'd love to bring you over, But then I realized, okay, what her fees were. She said, yes, I charge X amount. And I thought, well, put that in South African rands, we can't afford you. And I said, regretfully, I'm sorry, I would love to meet you, but I can't. But Arthur being Arthur and said, well, this is not a problem. Why don't you write a research proposal and get the funding to bring me over? And she put me in touch with the ALPS 8. So I wrote a proposal and sent it to her for critical reading. And she said, oh, this is good, so let's submit it. And so we got the funding, and that's where we started. A 2-year project, which involved other people, other colleagues and postgraduate students. And then when that funding ran out, I applied for a grant to carry it on with the NRF and so on. So we started this long-term relationship. That funding is just ending now, in fact. So it was serendipitous because I was appointed at Northwest University then as a research professor. Now, research professors a lovely job. You have a mandate. You don't do teaching, undergraduate teaching, postgraduate, but you basically have a blank slate. Your job is to make sure that research, is foregrounded to increase research outputs. That was a lovely job, very entrepreneurial, suited me. So I developed the research there as I wanted to, and that allowed me to introduce many, integrate, engage many postgraduate students. Marinda was one of them at that time, and a colleague. Most of them have continued in higher education in the school system, and they're still advocating and using action research in different forms. And so that is my gradual shift away from self-study action research towards a more collaborative form of participatory action research. But we actually use PALAR, which Archon had coined before, because we saw the need, and specifically in my context, to introduce action learning in, so that we could keep that self-reflective, self-study, working together to solve problems, but also focus on self in it. And so we've continued to develop it. She originally did it for developing capacity and professional development in higher education, and a lot in organizational development, in say action learning influence. But we're going now more towards community and specifically in vulnerable populations. So just a little bit about PALAR process, grounded in relationship, that we are working together, making sense, co-constructing knowledge, critical reflection the whole time, as in self-study action research, but also recognizing the learning that others bring, that it's not just experts, academic experts who know everything, but it's everybody's knowledge. So knowledge democracy, recognizing the knowledge that others bring to it. And so it's just a matter of you, the core action learning group or research groups meets regularly to work through this process, which I'll get into a bit more later on. So it results in leadership. Let me put this in a better order than I wrote it here. I think it starts with a self-directed lifelong action learning. You learn that through the PALAR process. And that leads to leadership development in your spheres of influence, which then leads to community. Without this process, I have found people saying, oh, we're doing PAR, we're doing participatory action research, we're doing community-based research. They're actually not. They're just going into communities and doing normal researcher-driven qualitative research. So I think without that focus on action learning, there's a tendency to default back to what we know. That's what I found in South Africa anyway. Researchers, academic researchers in general, apart from the people here, have not been used to stepping back and listening. They're not used to co-constructing knowledge. And the system we work in actually favors that kind of research, that researcher making all the decisions, having to have a proposal, having to decide on ethics and everything on your own before you even go into the community. So next step for me, they said, well, we work in entities in our university, research entities. So they said, well, research has to be conducted in entities. So as a research professor, you really should open up an entity. I want you to just do an actual research entity. You can't have a research entity. You know, this is the kind of thinking I was battling with. And I said, but they have them all over the world. They have organizations and action research. No, you can't do that. So we decided on, and it's not easy to start an entity. You have to go through all these hoops and you have to face a big panel and you have to convince them. So I thought, okay. Then somebody, the dean at that time, Robert Balfour, said to me, what about community-based? Because we need to do community engagement and there's nothing in the Faculty of Education about community-based research. So I said, fine. So we started that in 2018. Officially, a couple of years before that, I was working with a few people to try and get this through. We made the application in 2017, 2018, I was appointed director and it was official.